What's up, everybody? Today I wanted to do a quick review on a book that I read earlier in the year. This was actually one of the first books I read this year, I believe back in January. And I talked about it briefly on my channel, and I think I uploaded like a YouTube short for it. But I wanted to do more of a individual review for this book because this is one that I absolutely love. And for fellow fans of adult horror, I highly recommend you go check this book out. I want to bring more attention to this book. And the book we are talking about is Kin by Kealan Patrick Burke. I absolutely love this book. I've read a few other books by this author. I've read a few of his novellas, which is what he mostly writes. He has a lot of like self-published and indie publications of like 50 to 60 page novellas. I also read a short story collection by him called Dead Leaves, which I thought was okay. Most of his other work I found to be like okay, fine, decent. But this is the first book that I read by him that I absolutely loved. And this author has my newfound respect and admiration. The level of like talent and prose that he exhibits with this book is just absolutely incredible. And this book is one that I was kind of hesitant to talk more about it because I feel like this is one that you should go in somewhat blind. I don't really like to spoil anything. And with this book especially, it's hard to talk about it without addressing spoilers. But I will talk a little bit about the plot for this one. So the back of the book kind of describes it as being a sort of like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Deliverance style story. It deals with backwoods, cannibal, hillbillies, that sort of like subgenre of horror. And that is kind of what led me to want to seek this out and read this because I do love that little subgenre of horror. For whatever reason, that's just always been something that I've been into. I like that little niche subgenre. So I was always curious about this, and this book far exceeded my expectations. This is not a typical, like, slasher, just fun horror romp that's, full of just bloody kills and gore and, just kind of like a cheesy horror book. This is actually a very sophisticated and well-written story with a lot of emotion to it, very believable and well-written characters. There's a lot of themes in this story. There's a lot going on here. This is a very layered, well-told story. And yeah, before I continue on my rave review of this book, just me gushing over how much I love it, I'll tell you a little bit about the plot, just to kind of give you an idea of what it's about, to see if maybe it's something you'd be interested in reading. So basically, this book is split up into 3 parts, and there's a bit of a time gap in between each of these parts in the story. And this novel it's not real long. Let me double check here. I believe it's just shy of 300 pages. So it's on the leaner side. About 270 pages. So this is a pretty lean novel. It's a full-length novel, but it's on the leaner side. And each of these 3 parts is, I can't do math. What would that be? 270 divided by 3. That's what each of the 3 parts are, essentially. And I will say that these parts do vary in quality a little bit. We follow some different characters in each of these parts, and there are different events that happen. And then, while it is like one continual story, there's quite a bit of variance in between these 3 parts. But the book opens up following a character who has just escaped from the clutches of, I guess, what you could call like your typical backwoods hillbilly family, where she was being tortured and mutilated and other things were done to her by our villains, and she somehow manages to escape. And the story opens with her walking down the road. She can barely walk. She's like severely injured. It describes one of her eyes being like gouged out, and it's just like an empty socket. She's just walking down the road. Like, she can barely move, and she's just hoping and praying to find safety or somebody that will help her. And what continues on from this, from part 1 of the book, is a very intense part 1 where there's just this constant tension all the way throughout as this family is kind of searching for this girl and trying to recapture her because they don't want to be found out. They obviously don't want her to go to authorities and get help. And meanwhile, she is trying to escape. She's trying to seek help from some townsfolk or whoever will help her. And it's kind of like a cat and mouse game. It's very thriller-like. This is very much a horror book, but it does have a lot of elements in here of like a suspense or thriller as well. And this part one of the book is just so brutally intense. I could not put this book down. When I started reading this, I'm pretty sure I read part one in like one sitting or almost a single sitting. Like I could not put it down. That is how good it was. Part two, we get a bit of a time jump and we are introduced to some new characters in the story, and we follow some other characters that were like side characters in part one, and the story slows down quite a bit here. In part two, we get a bit more character development. There's a few like subplots going on, some character relationships. This was my least favorite part of the story. It wasn't necessarily bad. I do think we needed a little bit of character development. And part two also is kind of a build-up leading into part three of the story, which it deals with the good guys planning on getting revenge on the bad guys. Again, it's really kind of difficult for me to discuss this too much without giving anything away. I don't want to spoil too much. But yeah, part two is kind of a build-up. Some of the characters were traumatized by what happened to them in part one, or they had friends or family members that were victims to like this evil hillbilly clan, and they are planning on getting revenge on this family. And part two kind of builds that up and segues into part three, to where we get a super crazy final act, and they go back for like a final showdown, and there's this sort of big battle between the good guys and these crazy hillbillies, and yeah, things go down, gets pretty crazy and violent, and yeah, that's as much as I'll say about the plot. Again, I feel like it's best to go into this not knowing too much about it, and to just experience this for what it is. I feel like that's the best way to experience this novel. Yeah, I wanted to do kind of a quick review on this because I really want to bring more attention to this book. This is a book that, honestly, pretty much throughout the whole thing, I could not put this book down. Occasionally, I get just completely immersed into a story, and it feels like I'm right there, and I'm living alongside these characters, and I really care about them. I read a ton of books, and it doesn't really happen to me too often anymore. This book kind of managed to do that. It just pulled me right into the story, made me feel like I was right there, and it was just, yeah, an incredible experience. You feel a lot of sympathy for these characters. It makes you care about them. Again, they're very well written. And this book is very brutal, too. Things do not always turn out so well. There's quite a few deaths in here. And it does not shy away from like the violence and gore either. This is very much a horror book. At times, it borders on extreme horror almost. I wouldn't say it's quite to the level of like an extreme or like a splatterpunk horror book novel. I've read quite a few of those. This one, it like kind of teeters on that territory. It's not quite there, but it has some pretty disturbing scenes in it. There's some pretty nasty and gross stuff in this book. Some very explicit details when dealing with that subject matter. I feel like this would be kind of like a good gateway or introductory, like extreme horror novel, if that makes sense. If you're someone who's more like a casual horror fan, maybe this isn't for you, like go in knowing this is going to go a little bit further than your typical like mainstream horror novel. But yeah, this book is definitely very bloody, very intense, very suspenseful, and very well written too. I was shocked at how well written this was. Kealan Patrick Burke's prose is so good. He has the right balance. He manages to strike that balance between having like really good description and having some really beautiful and like well put together sentences with just the way he describes things. But it doesn't ever feel too much like too flowery or like he's trying to be too fancy with his writing. He still manages to like get to the point of the story and be very action oriented while still having like little sprinkles of just beautiful description. And yeah, I feel like a lot of authors kind of struggle to find that balance and will be either at like one end of the spectrum of having like kind of flowery prose or just being too action oriented and not really having enough description. I think he strikes the right balance here. The different parts too of this book, the three parts, I will say that with them being so different from one another, I think that some of the weaknesses start to come in with these sort of time gaps in between them and following the different characters. I feel like part 2 is the weakest of this book, which is one of like my minor negatives, like nitpicks I have with this book. I didn't hate it. I never lost interest in this, but I do think part 2, with it significantly slowing the story down, stepping away from the action, I feel like it kind of killed the tone a little bit and just was a bit jarring, kind of a jarring transition from these different parts. If I had to like rate the parts, I think part 1 is probably the strongest. I would give that like a perfect 5 out of 5 stars. Part 2, I would probably give like a 4 out of 5. It was just a bit slow, and I think some things in part 2 could have been summarized a little bit more. Maybe some of those subplots and like relationship stuff could have been cut out a little bit, or at least trimmed down. We didn't really need to get quite as much of that as we did. And then part 3, of course, picks things up with like going into the climax and the final act of the story and all of the crazy crap that happens at the end with the final battle. I did have like a few minor like nitpicks too in part 3, but nothing to really like ruin my overall enjoyment with this book by any means. Just like little minor issues, and I can't really address them either without spoiling it. So, but yeah, overall, I gave this book like a 4.5 out of 5 stars. I think this is probably the best horror novel that I've read that's come out within the last like decade or so. Actually, let me double check. I don't remember the exact date this came out. Let me see here. 2012. Okay, I guess it's been a little over a decade since it came out. But within like the last 15 to 20 years, this might be the best adult horror novel that I've read. And honestly, I think this might be one of my favorite horror novels of all time. This book is absolutely incredible, and I highly recommend that you check this out. I will admit that, again, this sort of subgenre, dealing with like cannibal hillbillies, that's something that tends to appeal to me. So, I don't know, this might not be for everybody, but I do think it's incredibly well written. It's a book that I highly, highly recommend, and I can see myself rereading this in the future. This book was absolutely just wonderful. Yeah. I don't know what else to say about it. I'm just kind of raving about this book, but I just wanted to bring more attention to it. That's Kin by Kealan Patrick Burke. Have you guys read this book? Have you read any of the other works by Kealan Patrick Burke? Some of the other novellas that I've read by him, The House on Abigail Lane, I've read Sour Candy, and then very recently I also read The Tent. And most of them were just kind of like okay, decent. Like I liked them, but they weren't really anything great. This is the only work that I've read by him that really blew me away. And from what I've seen about this author is he doesn't seem to have many novels. In fact, this is the only like full-length novel that I've seen that he's written. He might have a couple others out there that I just haven't noticed yet. But Kealan Patrick Burke, if you're watching this, you need to write more novels, man. I've read your novellas and some of your short stories, and they're decent, they're good, but I think you really, really shine in novel form. And I'm hoping to see some more novels from this guy in the future. And if he does write more, I will 100% be buying it and giving it a read. So yeah. So that's it, guys. I'm done raving about this book, spreading my love for it. If you have read this book, let me know what your thoughts are down in the comments below. And that's all I have for today, guys. I'll see you next time. Peace.